have your time now.
Thank you so much. Let me just share the screen. And full screen. And we're good to go. Okay. So thank you very much for the introduction, Cesaro. And thank you all for coming. My name is Moshe Zadka. My website is cobordism.com, where you can find every way of getting in touch with me known to humankind. And today I want to talk about empathy, sympathy, and how to engage with application teams. I want to start with an acknowledgement of country. I live in Belmont in the San Francisco Bay Area Peninsula, which is the ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush or Loni people. So let's start with some definitions. So what is empathy? What am I talking about? So the folk definition is like being nice or being understanding, something like that. Well, the definition I'm actually going to use is empathy is when you feel someone else's feeling, right? That's the source of the word, and that's what we're going to use as our definition. So a good example that you might know from your own life for empathy is that you might be feeling sad when your friend is sad. So sympathy, again, the folk definition is like also being nice or sometimes feeling pity, as in, I don't need your sympathy. But the actual definition I'm going to use is caring about someone else. I'm going to use the term sympathy and compassion interchangeably. They're pretty close. And an example is when you might offer to override a colleague's on call if you know they're tired, right? You are not feeling tired, they're feeling tired, but you're acting in a compassionate or sympathetic way by offering to override their on call so they can, have a bit of a break. So we're talking about in the context of SRE, which is in the context of the workplace. And is empathy useful in the workplace? Should we feel what our colleagues are feeling? We need to definitely care about our colleagues as people. That's sympathy in the workplace, right? We want to care about them as human beings who work with us and who have their own feelings and struggles. The big difference between sympathy and empathy is that when you care about people, when you feel compassion, when you feel sympathetic, you want to help them. But when you empathize, especially when you empathize with their struggles, that might often cause you pain. It's unpleasant, so it starts being a disincentive to empathy. And this is something that I'm gonna kind of talk about in various contexts. Sorry. So empathy is a very natural thing. It's part of what makes us people. In fact, it's even in other primates. It's a specific part of our brain structure. It's called mirror neurons. They're a very important part of how we understand feelings. But in the modern office scale, we are going to be working with, a lot of people, right? Even in a small team, right, of 10 people, that's already quite a few people. I'm sure many of us are working in bigger companies, all the way to like tens of thousands or maybe even hundreds of thousands of people if you're working in one of those really big companies. In SRE in general, one of the main questions we have about technologies we use is how do they scale, right? If you're used to deploying, say, Kubernetes, or you think about different web server technologies, one of the first questions we ask is like, how do they scale? Okay, so it works in a small scale on a toy example. Does it work on big examples? One of the biggest problems with empathy is that it does not scale well. So a few of the ways it fails to scale. So empathy and demographic diversity don't really work well. So it's harder to empathize with different genders than our own, right? They, we have different contexts and kind of feel different things about different situations. It's harder to empathize with people from a different ethnicity and other such things where people come from different cultures and different backgrounds. We can try, but we can be sure that we are actually, feeling what they are feeling in this situation. Um, Even more importantly, because usually when we say diversity, the biggest example people have in their mind is demographic diversity, gender, ethnicity, and so on. But there's also a lot of professional diversity in most of our teams, and especially site reliability engineers who have to work with a lot of different teams. We need to be aware of that. Um, and it's harder to empathize with someone with different trainings than our own. They will find different things painful, different things easy, and it's harder to empathize with that. It's harder to empathize with a different job function. They care about different things. Different things might be scaring them. Different things might not be worrying them that much. And that makes it harder, and so on, right? We have to work with people from a lot of professional backgrounds as well. And the last diversity I want to talk about that makes empathy sometimes harder is experience diversity. So it's harder to empathize with someone with more experience, um, because it's harder to understand how they could be perceiving the world and how they could be feeling. Um, Even worse, and kind of somewhat paradoxically, because everyone who has more experience at some point had less experience. Um, but in fact, when you have more experience, the way you perceive the world again changes so much that it will be harder to empathize with someone with less experience. Um, so those are some of the problems that happen when we try to use empathy in the workplace. Um, the other kind of diversity I want to talk about, because that's very important, is neurodiversity. People have all kinds of ways their brain processes situation. It's harder for neurotypical people to empathize with neurodivergent people, and that can often be a big problem. It's harder to understand why it is so hard for that person, why they're feeling so bad about it. So it makes it harder to empathize with. Um, and it's the same the other way. It's harder for neurodivergent people to empathize with neurotypical people. Um, and it's even hard for different people with different kind of neurodivergences to empathize with each other. It's not like someone with ADHD finds it very easy necessarily to empathize with an autistic person, or to empathize with someone with OCD or anxiety, right? All these things are classified as neurodiversity, but all that means is that it's different than the typical. It doesn't mean they're more similar to each other. Um, and that again is a big barrier to using empathy in the workplace. Um, and like the bottom line is that it's harder to empathize with people who are different from us in some critical way. And this means that if we rely on empathy for a lot of our jobs, that means that we rely on a tool that handles diversity really badly. Um, Empathy is really hard to judge when you fail. And one part that makes it harder to judge is the typical mind fallacy. And everyone has the typical mind fallacy, or at least I do, and I assume you all do, because I also have the typical mind fallacy. But a bit more seriously, this is actually like based on pretty solid research in this case. Um, this is something that really will stop you from understanding when your empathy has failed, right? So another thing that we are interested in site reliability engineers is, when our technologies fail, do they fail gracefully? Can we monitor the failure, or all the failures silent? The failures in empathy tend to be much more silent. Um, Empathy does not fail gracefully. When it fails, when it leads to misinterpretation, you're not aware of that, right? From your perspective, you think you are being empathetic, you think you are feeling someone else's feeling, but you're not. So and this is like, again, like something that, as site reliability engineers, we're already pretty used to care about. We used to care about how our technologies fail, right? Because we all understand that all technologies fail, and we like technologies that fail in some graceful way, and empathy does not do that. And because of that, empathy will lead to bad decisions. One of the hallmarks of like, kind of how you can recognize that it was empathy that has led to a particular bad decision is when you hear of someone doing this for their own good. Um, and again, as site reliability engineers, we're often in this position where we say, well, they should write their stuff with better monitoring, or they should already be upgrading their libraries, right? Like the reason we were enforcing that, or we're making it harder not to upgrade, or we're making it harder not to deploy without sufficient monitoring for their own good, right? And that's a hallmark of like, kind of a hint that we're like making a bad decision that's based on like a failure of empathy, right? Where we think we're being empathetic, we think we're feeling their feelings, we think we're doing the right thing, but we're actually not. And this is almost always wrong. You're not actually doing it for someone's own good. People are usually pretty good evaluators of what's good for them. However, in the face of an empathy failure, uh, that will kind of be invisible to you. Lastly, empathy is draining. Um, it takes more effort over the long term, even if it's a good idea in the short term. And again, we have a term for that, as site reliability engineers, right? This is exactly what we call tech debt, right? When you rely on empathy, you're building in a tech debt, right? In the short term, it's easier, it's sometimes more efficient than other ways of engaging, but in the long term, you can't sustain it, right? Eventually, you get too much tech debt, right? So that's kind of like drainage of empathy on kind of the team's capacity is exactly the way that tech debt will have an issue of being a problem in the long term. Sorry. So now that we've kind of talked about how sympathy and empathy works, right? And the problem with empathy, I want to kind of, site reliability engineering is a very big term. It means slightly different things to different people. If I was giving a talk of what is a site reliability engineer, that would be more than the entire time I have for this talk. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I am going to mention some salient facts about site reliability engineer to make sure that we are all here on the same page, that we're all talking about the same thing. We're all thinking about the same thing when we say site reliability engineering. The first thing I think we need to remember about site reliability engineering, and that's going to be very important later on in the talk, is that it's new. It's a very new engineering discipline, right? It's barely 10 years, if that, right? In 2011, the term was there, but very few companies were doing that. That was not as best practice. So maybe that's like the birth of SRE, right? If you want to point to like when SRE started becoming a thing that like, most companies do, that is considered part of the overall engineering discipline that people need, maybe even 5 years would not be a bad estimate. So it's an extremely new technology, extremely new engineering discipline, and that's going to be very important in a few minutes. The other thing to remember about SRE is that it's a very cross-disciplinary technology. At the very least, to be a good site reliability engineer, you need to understand systems really well, right? You need to understand stuff like TCP and low-level kernel and how hardware can malfunction and virtual machines and containers and all of these things that we're used to. And you also have to understand software, right? It is a software engineering sub-discipline, right? Just like front end or database are all software disciplines, right? This is also a software discipline, right? You have to know how to write code that scales well and work and does its job. And that's the bare minimum to be a site reliability engineer, which means it's a very cross-disciplinary specialization. And so usually the way people come to be SREs is some sort of cross-training. The first model, and the one that tends to have most of the people inside for all kinds of reasons, is when an administrator, a system administrator, becomes an SRE, right? That means someone who already understands systems, who's already kind of did operations, who already understands how computers can break, learns just enough software skills to be able to automate a lot of this stuff, to think about this in a bit of a higher level from a pipeline perspective. That's a very typical way of cross-training. A different, like the counter cross-training, which is very popular, is when a software engineer becomes an SRE, right? Someone who knows how to write code, somehow gets involved in systems operation, in how things can break, and becomes an SRE. For I guess full disclosure, this is the path I took. So obviously I have my own biases in like my history of cross training, but that's again something that some people do. SRE is a separate group, or at least a separate specialization from systems operations, although we have to understand many of similar things. But we do have to interact with system operations people. The maybe flashiest place we end up interacting with operations is when an incident occurs, right? There'll be some back and forth between site reliability engineering and operations. The less flashy, but no less important engagement that we have in operation is regular maintenance. And in fact, part of good engagement between SRE and Ops is how to make sure that the scheduled maintenance does not become an incident. And sometimes that's merely just talking about how to schedule and communicate that we have a planned downtime. Sometimes it's more subtle than that. The other team that site reliability engineer will often have to engage with is software engineering, right? The people who write product for the company. A lot of the time that will be code collaboration. They'll be working on similar code bases, right? The software engineer is supposed to work on like the product feature, and the site reliability engineer will help with the reliability architecture, sometimes testing frameworks or testing framework integration, or sometimes just code reviewing to make sure that this is up to standards and can't break things too badly. One frequent way of structuring site reliability engineering organizations is not to have the organization, or to have like a horizontal organization, or whatever people sometimes call it, which is embedded SRE. That means that there'll only be like one or two SREs working inside a product team, and they'll be in charge of like making sure that the team basically keeps up with SRE best practices. And again, like all of these things are important contextually to understand like when we need to engage, how we need to use all these tools. So one of the main ways that SREs will end up interacting with a software engineer is by education, right? We teach software engineers how to do things in a way that scales to production, that doesn't cause problems, and so on. Another form of engagement that we engage in is to help a software engineer. When they do run into a problem, we try to help them figure out how to deal with it. And finally, and that's maybe like, something that, doesn't need to be talked about, because again, it's the flashiest way of engaging with software engineers. I'm mentioning it for completeness, but this is like the most stereotypical maybe way of engaging, right, is building tools, right? We build tools, libraries or command line tools, or even sometimes web tools, depending on what we need, that the software engineers will use to, become more productive, to cause less incidents, and so on. So all these things are forms of engagement between SRE and software engineering. So until now, I haven't talked about what I promised you I will talk about, right? Which is how to use empathy and sympathy to engage with teams. But I feel like I can't talk about that before I, explain like sympathy, empathy, and site reliability engineering in separate. So let me recap the first part of the talk, and then we'll talk about, now that we have a shared background, I can actually explain how we can use those technologies to engage better. So let's recap what we have done so far. We explained what empathy is, we explained what sympathy is, and we talked a little bit about the salient facts in site reliability engineering that will be important to understand how to engage well. So the first part is to always remember to engage with sympathy and compassion, right? And that starts with trusting people. Trusting them that when they say things, especially about themselves, they're correct. They know themselves, and they have, a special relationship with themselves of understanding. And this, like after we have accomplished the baseline of trust, now we want to also engage with caring for them. We want to make sure that we have compassion, that we care about what, how they're feeling and how they're dealing with things. So let's kind of talk about some examples of how to use those principles in engaging. So I'm sure, like many of you, I'm a big fan of chaos engineering. I think this can improve reliability for teams a lot. But I'm sure, like many of you, have also faced resistance often from software engineering organizations while you're implementing chaos. And again, often it's very easy to kind of start getting into like this conflict, right, which is unproductive, right? So if we have decided to engage and to actually start implementing chaos, we want to start by acknowledging that this is going to cause pain, right? In the long term, it's going to be worth it, but this will cause a lot of pain. We don't want to minimize the pain, right? We don't have to feel the pain, right? We can't, maybe really empathize with that pain, but we can talk about acknowledging the pain that we're causing, that this is going to be unpleasant. So once we've acknowledged that this is going to cause the pain, now we can engage honestly in how do we alleviate the pain? How do we make that pain less? And that's, some people will start with that, but that's actually the last step. We want to acknowledge that we cause pain, to fully have compassion, to fully feel that we know we're causing pain. Only then can we engage this honest conversation about alleviation. And part of the reason we want to engage in this honest conversation is we want to ask people, what will alleviate the pain? We don't want to make any assumptions, right? that would be trying to use empathy. That would be trying to understand how their pain works. But instead, we can ask. One benefit of asking is that people feel like their voice is being heard. That already um, causes this relationship of trust that will make it easier to implement the chaos. Another, again, example is on-call interaction. We already talked a little bit about that when we talked about engaging, right? Like one of the things that happens is that like a software engineer is on an on-call rotation. They have an incident, and often that incident requires the help of someone from the SRE part of the organization. So remember, this is going to be very distracting to them. They were probably doing something else, even if they were on call, and this is going to be unpleasant. This is often also a place of unfamiliarity, right? A lot of people, they've had some experience doing writing code, but when they actually interacting with the systems at the level of depth you need to actually solve problems, this is unfamiliar, right? This is scary. We want to acknowledge that, right? We want to be nice about it, right? We want to be kind about it, even if it's hard to empathize, because for me, like for many of you, this is a place we're familiar with, that we understand these things. So it might be harder to empathize with someone for why they're feeling scared of that, or frustrated or worried, but we can acknowledge that this might be something new to them, and be kind about it, and be helpful. Another example is when you're designing the on-call rotation. And again, doesn't matter who's gonna be on the rotation. That can be done with compassion. And the first part is to acknowledge that this is annoying to your personal life, right? You're gonna have to do things differently, right? You have to be next to a network, doing your rotation, and you're gonna have to sometimes wake up at unpleasant hours. This is gonna interfere with your personal life. And because people have different personal lives, it's sometimes very hard to empathize with like what's frustrating or hard for them, but we can acknowledge that. We can sympathize, we can act with compassion about it. And so again, like we want to ask, what kind of things will be the most disruptive to your life? How can I design around it? And there's like many tools we understand, right? About how to do that, right? We can have secondaries, we can have follow the sun rotations depending on the specific situation we're in. We can have short rotations or long rotations. There's like different ways we can do that. But if we start with compassion, if we start with acknowledging that this is unpleasant, and we ask people what will make it better, then we have a better chance of actually making a better on-call rotation. And that means you want to involve people in the trade-offs. Again, for us, this is often not our first instinct. As engineers, we like to build the solution, figure all the things out, and then give people the solution fully formed. That feels as a much bigger accomplishment. But in this case, part of being compassionate is involving the people in the trade-offs, because at least they'll have made the choice that they know they can live with. So another important example of engagement is post-mortem. And I would have said blameless. And I think this is a good example of how to engage with compassion. But I'm not going to talk about it because you already knew that. One of the important reasons to mention it is that to explain how much not of a groundbreaking thing this is. For postmortems, we already understood how important engaging with sympathy and compassion is. So that's a good example for like something that we've already been doing for a while. one thing that sometimes is very hard to forget, sorry, it's very easy to forget, is that you want to acknowledge that while remediating the incident, this was hard work, right? Especially when the beginning of the timeline is like it was detected and 10 hours later we remediated. That can sound like you're not saying like how much hard work it took, even if it did take, sorry, 10 hours. So this is like one of the my favorite bits to do in a postmortem, to say like, I understood it, like, everybody worked really hard and took on specific hard work, right? You took, time to like, fix that. And I know that you stayed an hour extra to help with that. I appreciate all of the work people did in remediation. This is really important. This is engaging with compassion. um, and you know, even in the face of a blameless postmortem, I've seen that this is still not universal. So we can still do better in compassionate postmortem. And I think maybe this is a better title for, like, how we engage with postmortems rather than blameless. Rather than thinking of it like it's what we're not doing, think of it as what we are doing. Compassionate postmortem. Um, if you're building tooling, then usually your tooling comes to alleviate specific problems, right? Like, otherwise don't build it if you're not fixing a problem. Um, I find it often, because it's so much fun to build tooling, it's really easy to go off and just, build the tool. Um, it's much less kind of, immediately satisfying to start it with a conversation, to listen to where people have pain points. And sometimes our tool can't fix all the pain points, and maybe not even the worst of the pain points. And that might be an an okay trade-off, but it's important to acknowledge that trade-off, to say, I understand that this tool will not alleviate some of these pain points. I understand that. I'm sorry, I would have loved to do that, but right now this is not the highest priority. Um, if the tool causes new pain points, again, it's really important to acknowledge that, to not minimize the pain that it will cause. And if you still think it's a good idea to do that, which often it might be the case, um, then then to acknowledge that. And even if you decide you can't fix it, explain very clearly that you understand this is causing you pain. Another example that I've engaged in more than once in different places is when you want to deprecate a service, right? There's an old service that does something that could be better done by a different service. This happens. You want to, stop the old service because it's a maintenance burden. That's very legitimate again. Um, but it's important to acknowledge that this will cause disruption, and to not minimize the disruption that this causes, um, and to not minimize the estimated effort, right? I often see um, SRE teams, when they start engaging with that, they start saying, this is not a big deal. Why are you making it such a big deal? This shouldn't take more than 2 hours, right? And um, maybe it wouldn't take you more than 2 hours because you know the service well enough to deprecate it. But someone who needs to engage with that, right, might need to learn a new part of the system that has been, pretty stable and nobody touches it a lot, right? It's gonna take them longer. And this is an example of like how empathy would be, failing not gracefully, right? You're like, when you try to empathize, you're saying, well, it wouldn't have taken me that long. Why would it take you, right? You're trying to feel their feelings, but you're mistaken about how they're feeling. If someone says it's going to take me that long, you don't need to argue. You can acknowledge that respectfully and compassionately. And then once you've done that, you can ask, is there a way of me deprecating that can help? For example, will it be useful first to gather logs so you can see exactly where your system is using this service, because sometimes those things are not trivial to see. Um, or can I, duplicate it? Can I, do something in staging? There's like all kinds of ways you can theoretically make it easier. And it's very hard to know what will make it easier unless you first understand and acknowledge that this is going to cause effort and build that level of trust where people feel free to talk about that. So a similar example is when you have to break backwards compatibility in a given service. Maybe that service already supports, API level 2 and API level 1. Again, that's a pain to maintain. You want to, again, acknowledge the disruption. You want to see if you can do some kind of gradual rollout of the backwards compatibility. But it's important to brainstorm on that, to engage with the customers of this service and to talk to them as you're thinking about different options. Okay, sorry. So, right. Another example is when we do code reviews. This is a really important part of our job, right? We'll sometimes be called in to code review other people's code who have written stuff to see, like, if they're using, maybe like it's a software engineering team that starts to use Terraform or some other kind of IAC, maybe Helm or Kubernetes, and we'll come in to do a code review to see if their code looks the way we think. And often it's not, right? This is often like the reason we get called in for code reviews, because this is the team's first attempt to use technology like that. It's very easy to say, to start with, like, this is really bad. Here are all the things it's bad. But when we engage with compassion, right, we want to start by acknowledging that this is hard work, right? This is like starting to use the technology. And that this is important, right? Acknowledging that this is important hard work is a really important thing in the code review. It sounds silly to, like, literally write that down sometimes in the code review, but it is actually extremely helpful and will give much better context for the rest of the comments. And then the other thing that's very useful is when we act compassionately, to ask questions in the code review instead of telling people what not to do. We can ask, questions like, why did you do it this way? How are you going to handle the problem where this pathway failed? Right? These are all important questions, and the point is they come off as questions, right? People can answer them. They can say, oh, that failure is not likely. Or they can actually say, oh, I haven't considered that. Let me fix that. But you still have engaged with more compassion than you would be if you started out by saying, just fix that. Speaking of that, you want to avoid the word just, right? This is just a harmful word. If you ever say just write a function, or just put it in the YAML, or you can literally like convey the same amount of information by dropping the word just and say, you can write a function to do that, or you can put it in the YAML, or you can make it a separate file without adding the word just. You can just put it in the YAML. You can just write a new file. You can just make a new function. The only thing that you're losing is the implication that this is something that's easy to do. Now, if it's indeed something easy to do, then great, they'll do it easily. If it's something that's easy for you and not easy for them, right? Then you have not implied that it's easy for them, and you have, lost nothing, right? So this is a harmful word that I really recommend just completely avoiding when you're doing code reviews. The other example I want to give is when we do infrastructure as code. Again, especially when we want to move a team from, like, manually, or like, via the console, managing their infrastructure to doing something like Terraform. Then when we engage in that, right, it's really important to acknowledge the downside, right? Now, infrastructure as code is awesome. I love it. I have, tried to move many teams to that. The most, the best way to do that is to not pretend like it's better than it is. To start by saying, this will have downsides. This will mean that when you want to do something, there's like more steps, that you can have bugs in that code that you will have to fix, that this will not sometimes be obvious what's going on, right? The UI with the console is much easier to explore. Acknowledging the downside is really important when we try to build something, because people are going to see a downside whether we acknowledge it or not. When we acknowledge it, we're just showing that we care about it, that we're not dismissing that, like, why should you need to explore it? Like, you can just read the documentation, right? Again, like the problem with using the word just. And then once you've, you know, talked about that, you can ask for the feedback on the plan, right? Like, how do we start using the infrastructure as code, right? How do we start gradually? Can we roll it out on like some less complicated infrastructure and get the team used to the process? Or can we start in a different environment or maybe a different region? Sometimes that's helpful. So the way to do it is not to tell people what you're going to do. You can offer these things as options, right? This is part of our specialty as site reliability engineers, to think about all these options, but to ask for the feedback, right? To say what will be helpful to you. That would be engaging in a sympathetic and compassionate way. So I've kind of been talking, I think, bad things about empathy for a long time. And you know, I'm sure that as site reliability engineers, we all have our technology preferences, and we can all, you know, rag on a language we don't like or an operating system we don't like for a long time. But these things exist for a reason, right? And just like that, empathy exists for a reason. So I'm not saying that empathy is bad, right? I want to make it very clear after ragging it for so long. One place where this technology is useful is when you design, right? When we design with empathy, we use a low resolution stand-in. Maybe again, as site reliability engineers, we're used to that, right? Because this is no different than using, say, unit test or continuous test or staging environment. We understand that this is not an accurate representation of the production environment, but this is a good low resolution stand-in that will let us iterate much faster. So similarly, when we use empathy to design, this is a good way to get a low resolution stand-in. We understand we can't feel people's feelings accurately, but we can do it inaccurately, right, with mistakes, just like the staging environment is not the same as the production environment. So that's a low resolution stand-in. When we engage with empathy. We validate the design assumptions based on people's feedback. And for that, we have to believe people. And again, this is no different than not saying this works just fine on my machine. I can't believe it's breaking on production. If it's breaking in production, you have to start by believing that. And the same thing, right? If you designed it well, right, but like your assumptions were not correct when people and now you know because people said that, you need to start by believing them. Which means that very similar to the development loop, this is a design engage loop, right? You design with empathy, you make the best plan you can, then you engage with sympathy and compassion, you figure out what went wrong, and you iterate, right? And again, this is something we're all very, very familiar with from all the other stuff we do, right? We start by building something simple, we you know, push it to production, see what happens, and we iterate as fast as we can. So let me kind of give some examples of how you can use empathy, right? If you're designing a command line interface, it's really useful to think about people's feelings, right? To try to feel people's feelings, to think, what could be scary here, right? Um, so often our command line tools do very big things, so they can be pretty scary. If you're designing a remote API, again, you want to imagine people's feelings. You want to feel their feelings of frustration if errors are not clear, right? This is a good example of empathizing with a person. If you're designing a library API, one really important thing is how do we version, right? And again, you want to imagine people's feelings, right? Like, as they're frustrated by inaccurate versioning or unsure, right? Or uncertain, right? That's an unpleasant feeling that you want to empathize with, so you can make sure that your versioning strategy is clear. If you're designing a web front end, which we sometimes do, right? Like for, mostly internal tools, you want to think what paths with the web front end are going to be painful and for whom, right? Again, this is important, right? This will have us empathizing with people, trying to feel their feeling, to see like what parts will be painful. But again, this is like it's a design step, right? If you're designing an installer, right? I'm sure we've all had installers that failed in weird ways, and didn't tell you what you need to fix to get the installation to work correctly. So you want to think, how can it fail, and how frustrating will it be? If you're designing a base container image, you can imagine the, you know, frustration and stress that it takes to upgrade to a new base. On the one hand, you want to make sure that you can upgrade. On the other hand, you don't want to do it too often, right? Like those things can be very anxiety producing, and you want to empathize with that anxiety to minimize it. If you're designing a CI/CD pipeline, right, you want to empathize with the impatience people have, right? How can we help ship left? How can we help catch the errors as soon as they occur, so that people don't have to wait for the entire pipeline to finish, or maybe not even to start if you can do a reasonable local emulation, so that you can avoid this kind of feeling of impatience and frustration. So I'm almost at the end of our time, so this is time to wrap up a bit. So what is the goal of site reliability engineering? So there's like one phrase that I really love, that I will repeat it every opportunity I can, because I think it's really important. The goal of site reliability engineering is to reduce the operational load, not to shoulder that, right? We don't come in and say, okay, we'll take over the on-call rotation, we'll feel the pain. We need to reduce the operational load, which means our work is very different than traditional ops, right? We're not coming in to be another ops team. The ops team, I'm sure, is an extremely good ops team. But we're also not doing traditional software engineering. And because of that, we have a higher level of diversity in all aspects, because there are no traditional paths to site reliability engineer. It's such a new discipline that traditional paths hasn't had time to be created. And we have to be working with people from across the organization, with software engineers, with the product management team, with the project management teams, and sometimes with other teams as well. So what do I want you to take away with that? Listen with your heart. Really care about people as they're talking. Engage with compassion. Engage in a way that cares about people, that treats their feelings as important, that treats their humanity as important. Believe people. This is maybe the most important takeaway here. When people say, this is not good for me, this is painful, this is scary, you need to believe them. Software is ultimately made of feelings, right? We're not dealing with atoms, right? Like all we have in software are just our feelings made into code. And the job of site reliability engineering is basically to improve the feelings that go into the code to make the code better. So this is not an accidental part of site reliability engineering. This is not an extra skill. This is part of our core skill set to think about these feelings. And with that, I think like I'm right at the end of my time, and we do have some time for questions. So I will open the floor for questions now. Thank you all.